he, I think, has recognized that you have to create the conditions for this conflict to be brought to an end. So I applaud the efforts that he is making, and also Republicans in the US Senate and others as well who are joining with them to apply more economic pressure on Putin to bring this conflict to an end. We want, it's going to be difficult for Ukraine, I think, but there is a way forward to arrive at that. But unless we are going to then step up and recognize that if we don't start to do things differently, we're going to be faced with a similar situation in a few years' time.
Tonight, the French President Emmanuel Macron is at another lavish dinner. This time it's at the Guildhall in the City of London. Tomorrow, he'll join the Prime Minister at a meeting of the so-called Coalition of the Willing, nations prepared to provide security guarantees if there is a ceasefire in Ukraine. It comes after the French President said their two countries should lead the efforts to bolster support for Ukraine and could no longer rely on the United States. This was Sir Keir Starmer speaking earlier today.
Today, the UK is proud to stand shoulder to shoulder with France, leading the coalition of the willing to support Ukraine, as well, of course, as working together to call for a sustainable peace in the Middle East.
Well, Penny Mordaunt is a former Defence Secretary. Good evening to you, Penny.
Good evening.
Great to have you with us. Do you think that President Macron was right when he told Parliament this week that Britain and France actually have to take the lead in bolstering support for Ukraine because we simply can't rely on the United States?
Look, I think that Europe has to step up and it has to take responsibility for its own neighbourhood and its own interests. And of course, within Europe, Britain and France have been major contributors to our collective defence. But I think you can't confuse that with structures and mechanisms which provide you with a credible deterrent. And what we know is that NATO is a very effective deterrent. Things like EU structures, the EU battle group, for example, has never ever got out the door. And its criteria for deploying are not clear. And what you end up with is a coalition of the willing. You just end up with not something that is going to deter Russia or another aggressor. You end up with a group of people who feel like taking action or retaliating at the time, and that isn't a credible deterrent.
So and even that coalition of the willing, I mean, many of those nations have already made it clear that they're not prepared to actually deploy any troops on the ground. They might provide perhaps more assistance, perhaps provide more weapons or training to Ukrainian forces. But I mean, without the US getting involved, isn't that coalition of the willing pretty toothless?
Well, look, I think, first of all, Europe has to step up and it has to do more to protect its own neighbourhood. We've just had a defence review, which is supposed to be a NATO first defence review. NATO has agreed a new floor, so for pure defence spending, 3.5% GDP. Everyone agreed to that at the last NATO meeting, bar one nation that had special dispensation. But people aren't doing it. Despite that big announcement and an ambition to reach 5% with a few other things folded in, there was nothing in the spending review to show how we're going to get there. So I'm sorry, but I keep appearing on the airwaves on all channels saying the same thing. Britain needs to wake up. It needs to fund defence, and our European partners need to do the same. The US, I think, I'm slightly more confident. I think they will remain a good, solid partner, but they've been very clear that we have to buck up and we have to take responsibility for our own neighbourhood. And so that's the first thing. The second thing is the mechanisms that you deploy under need to be really clear to your opponent. And if Russia has and sees no credible deterrent to future aggression, guess what's going to happen? It's going to do the same thing in a few years' time.
And we've seen some of the heaviest bombardment since the start of the war in recent days and weeks on Ukraine by Russian forces. How significant do you think it is that President Trump does appear to have had a change of heart and actually given the go-ahead for more US supplies, military supplies, to go to Ukraine after it had been announced that they were going to be halted?
Look, I think Trump does realise what a good outcome looks like in this, and he's come under a lot of stick for things he's said, but he, I think, has recognised that you have to create the conditions for this conflict to be brought to an end. So I applaud the efforts that he is making, and also Republicans in the US Senate and others as well who are joining with them to apply more economic pressure on Putin to bring this conflict to an end. We want, it's going to be difficult for Ukraine, I think, but there is a way forward to arrive at that. But unless we are going to then step up and recognise that if we don't start to do things differently, we're going to be faced with a similar situation in a few years' time. I mean, it begs the question: what will it take for the UK and Europe to wake up to the reality of this? I think every man in the street gets this. Why is it that our governments don't?
Well, I want to ask you about the other news we've had in the last hour tonight. The former Conservative Party chairman, Sir Jake Berry, has announced that he's defecting to Reform UK. This is what he told The Sun in a video released earlier tonight.
For 30 years, I supported the Conservative Party. For 14 years, I was one of their MPs, sitting at that cabinet table twice. And I want to tell you today, my friends, that I have come to a decision. The old parties do not have what it takes to transform our country, to build a Britain we can believe in again. And that's why I've decided to join the Reform Party. It is only Reform and Nigel Farage who can deliver a Britain that we are proud of again.
Well, that is a video from Sir Jake Berry. I'm Penny, as someone who's been a stalwart member of the Conservative Party and served in government alongside Sir Jake Berry. What do you make of that?
Well, look, I'd say two things. Firstly, I'm always sad to see someone leave my party and go to Reform. Jake is the latest. We've seen it happen with some of our councillors, and that's extremely depressing to me, because when you look at what Labour is doing to our country, I mean, talk now of things that were unimaginable a short while ago, wealth taxes. We're going to finally boot out the last wealth creators that are still here, where London is second only to Moscow for the number of investors that have left since.
Yeah, but people who are worried about that seem to be increasingly turning to Reform rather than to the Conservatives.
So this is my point. We have to stick together. Those people that want to support people that take responsibility, the makers and creators, those people that create opportunities for other people, build businesses and pay taxes so we can have great public services. We need to stick together to form an opposition and to form a credible alternative at the next general election. I'm afraid Jake has fallen for the hype. Reform is a party, I would just point out. We think Labour have got now something like there's a 57 billion black hole to fill at the next budget and counting. At the last general election, Reform would have added 150 billion to public expenditure, and they fielded candidates in Scotland that were there to break up the United Kingdom. They were standing on a platform of independence while Nigel Farage was draping himself in the Union flag. So I don't know what Jake thinks he's gone to, but it certainly isn't a different flavour of Conservative Party. And that may be... Are
you at all tempted to follow suit, Penny?
Absolutely not, because I know that if this country spent 150 billion extra on public spending, it would be a disaster. I mean, Rachel Reeves is doing a bad job, but she looks prudent in comparison to Reform spending plans.
And but this doesn't say much for Kemi Badenoch's leadership, does it? If someone like Sir Jake Berry now thinks that Reform UK has the solutions rather than the
No,
Conservative Party.
I think sadly, and he's a good friend, and I've got a lot of time for him, but I think he's wrong. I think that the only way we are going to have the answers to the difficult challenges facing this country in a very changed world and a fast changing world is to do the hard yards. Kemi knows you can't fake that. She's doing the policy work. She's listening to people. And where she can make a difference in the interim on those campaigns you've seen her and her front bench doing on the education stuff, on securing various U-turns from the Prime Minister, and they're still pursuing other things like the family farm tax and other crazy socialist, Stalinist policies from Labour. She's going to fight all every hour that God sends to get those policies reversed.
Okay.
But you can't fake this, and if people are serious about stopping a Labour government doing what it's doing, which is wrecking this country, and they want a hope-filled policy platform that is going to enable this country to reach its full potential, then they need to stick with the Conservatives.
Penny Mordaunt, former Defence Secretary, great to speak to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.